Hello and welcome to our continuing Bible study series, What We Need to Know About Religions of the World. Today, what we need to know about Islam, part 2. We've been looking first at the three monotheistic or Abrahamic religions, Christianity, Judaism, and now Islam, spending 2 weeks on each. So this is the second and final week on Islam. Next week, we will begin a 2-week examination of Buddhism and then conclude with Hinduism. So I hope this is helpful. Understanding some of the basics of these religions hopefully will help us be more not just tolerant, but respectful of different people's religious beliefs. Today, we will begin looking at the Quran. This is the holy book of Islam. The Quran is considered by most Muslims to be the literal words of Allah, God. It was given through the angel Gabriel to Muhammad and recited by Muhammad to be sure that it was accurate. Muhammad was not literate, but he recited, prompted by Gabriel, recited the words to be sure they were accurate, and then they were later preserved in written form by scribes, written in Arabic, which is the holy language of Islam. The Quran is a record of a series of revelations from God to Muhammad over a 22-year span, beginning with the night of power and excellence all the way to the end of Muhammad's life. Muslims consider the Quran a miraculous text that helps shape the grammar and the syntax of the Arabic language, also beautiful poetry. The Quran was written in Arabic, which continues to be the official language of Islam. The text was preserved in oral and then written form during the Prophet's life, but it was only collected and compiled in its current format 10 to 12 years later under the reign of the third of the rightly guided caliphs, Uthman ibn Affan, sorry about that pronunciation, who lived from 644 to 656. It was organized with longer chapters first. Those were from the time in Medina, and then the shorter chapters second, which were during the Prophet's time in Mecca. Muslims memorize Quranic verses in Arabic, and it is vital for use in daily prayers. The Quran begins in the name of God, the merciful and compassionate. The Quran accepts the Torah and the New Testament as revelations from God, but they had become, Islam believes that the Torah and the New Testament had become corrupted over time. For example, Jesus seen as the Son of God or God the Son. The Trinitarian theology Islam sees as a corruption of the revelation of God. The Quran was sent as a corrective. It has 114 chapters, 6,000 verses, and so is relatively short. Islam sees itself as the natural successor to and corrective of Christianity, much as Christianity saw itself as the successor to and corrective of Judaism. It assumes that there are three realms in creation, heaven, earth, and hell, that there are two types of beings, humans and spirits. And of the spirits, there are angels, jinns, from which we get our term genie, and devils and Satan. That Adam was the first man, and he received God's spirit. So Islam does not believe in original sin. God, the Creator, is central to the Quran's worldview. God's name is mentioned 2,500 times. Allah is all-powerful, transcendent, all-knowing, the sustainer, the ultimate judge, but also merciful and compassionate, very much like the images in our Old Testament and New Testament of God. Jesus is seen as a prophet, a human being, much like Muhammad, and they believe that to see Jesus as divine is idolatry. There are no images of God, no graven images, and very few of humans in Islamic art. The Quran does not reveal God, but reveals God's will. And that is a pretty significant distinction, and I think that Christians and Jews might say something very similar. It reveals God's will, something of God's nature, but doesn't reveal God, some things about God. In terms of poverty and social justice, in the context of 7th century Arabia, these are major themes. The Quran asserts the responsibility of the rich for the poor, that is through the giving of the tithe, the equality in status of men and women, which may surprise many, and a tolerance for other faiths. Some quotations from chapter 51, verse 49. Men and women are equal in the eyes of God. Man and woman were created to be equal parts of a pair. That's actually very similar to several things that the Apostle Paul writes. Men and women are equally responsible for promoting a moral order and adhering to the 5 pillars of Islam. Chapter 9, verses 71 and 2. Love and justice are the signs of God in family life, not cruelty. To quote, the best of you is seen by who is best to his wife. That's from Muhammad. There is to be no compulsion in religion. Chapter 2, verse 256. Jews and Christians are regarded also as people of the book, people who have also received a revelation and scripture from God. Surely the believers, the Jews and Christians, whoever believes in God shall have their reward. Chapter 2, verse 62. All right, so what does the Quran say about jihad? Well, the greater jihad is the struggle for spiritual purity, to live a virtuous life, to extend the Islamic community through mission work. Whereas lesser jihad is violent holy war in defense of Islam. This came from the conflict with Mecca and the struggle to survive that was later interpreted as aggressive. Efforts have been made to define what is just war when peace is the norm. That same struggle has happened in Christianity, I know. If the Quran says, if your enemy inclines toward peace, then you must make peace. Chapter 8, verse 61. Islam forbids the killing of non-combatants, as well as women, children, monks, and rabbis, unless they take part in the fighting. And that would certainly seem to reject the idea of terrorism. Many of the sword verses in the Quran are often abused, taken out of context, and they have been used as the rationale during Islam's imperial period for the use of force to expand. Does the Quran condone terrorism? Historically and today, some Muslims have engaged in terrorism using the Quran to justify their actions. But the Quran does not advocate or condone terrorism. Islam does permit and even requires at times to defend themselves, their family, their religion, their community from aggression. Jews and Christians must ask, does the Bible condone terrorism? And we can say certainly holy war is seen as God's will, for instance, in the book of Joshua and elsewhere in the Bible. But I would suggest that the Bible, too, does not condone terrorism. It is anathema to what we know of the will of God. The Quran says, whoever transgresses against you, respond in kind. An eye for an eye, a tooth for a tooth. So the Quran, much like the Bible, is a mixture of sayings that can be taken out of context, put in different contexts, and that some teachings seem to advocate violence, others seem to completely abhor violence. All right, let's shift now to Islamic history. Muhammad's death in 632, remember he was born in 570, so 30, 52, 60, 62 years later. Sorry, my math is not good. So when he died at age 62, that experience led the 85% of Muslims considered Sunnis to choose the 4 rightly guided caliphs as the successors to the Prophet, one at a time, obviously. Muhammad had expanded the Muslim state to all of Arabia, and the first 4 caliphs lived simply and righteous lives, and they strove hard for the religion of God. That's why they were called rightly guided. Their justice was impartial. Their treatment of others was kind and merciful. They were one with the people, the first among equals. Later caliphs assumed the manners of kings and emperors, and the true spirit of equality of ruler and ruled diminished to a considerable extent in the political life of Muslims. It's a very familiar story in almost every culture. The rightly guided caliphs, first Abu Bakr, who was Muhammad's closest advisor and his father-in-law, he was the first caliph following Muhammad's death. Remember when a split occurred, when the minority, the party of Ali, the Shias, thought that it should be more hereditary and that Ali was Muhammad's closest living male relative, his first cousin. And he was passed over 3 times to be the successor. Finally, he was elected after 35 years, and then ironically and sadly was assassinated just a few years later. Ali's son, Hussein, was killed in a skirmish with the Sunni army, and the martyrdom of Hussein is still remembered and reenacted. Umar was the second, and Uthman was the third of the rightly guided caliphs. Ali was the fourth and the last of the rightly guided caliphs. With the death of Ali, the first and most notable phase in the history of Muslim people came to an end. And again, to make a connection to Christianity, you might say that the first period also of the Christian church was that period following the death and resurrection of Jesus up until the transition of the Christian church into the state church of Rome in the 4th century. So with the death of Ali, the first and most notable phase in the history of the Muslim peoples came to an end. All through this period, it had been had been the book of God and the practices of his messenger, Muhammad, the Quran, and the Sunni, the model, the example, which had guided those leaders. It was the time when the ruler and the ruled, the rich and the poor, the powerful and the weak were all uniformly subjected to the divine law. It was an epoch of freedom and equality, of God consciousness and humility, of social justice, which recognized no privileges, and of an impartial law, which accepted no pressure groups or vested interests. After Ali, Muawiyah assumed the caliphate, and thereafter the caliphate became hereditary, passing from one king to another. Again, to make a connection to Christianity, I'm reminded of what the book of Acts says about the early church living as one, sharing with all who had a need. It's almost an idealized form. The Umayyad dynasty from 661 to 750 emerged from the conquered remainder of the Persian Empire and part of maybe half of the Byzantine Empire. Remember, those two old empires were pressuring Arabia during the lifetime of Muhammad, and they finally were overcome and fell, and the Umayyad dynasty was made up of parts of their remainder. This marked a transitional time from the 4 rightly guided caliphs to imperial Islam. The Umayyad achievements and their wealth and power brought conflict with traditional Arab ways of life. There were several splits, including a split with the Shia, and this dynasty ended after a slave revolt in 750. The Abbasid Empire from 750 to 1258, so some 500 years, represented an Islamic community that was wealthy and powerful. There were great cultural achievements and a strong centralized government. Great Muslim contributions were made to law, to theology, art, philosophy, literature, medicine, math, science, and architecture. Muslim scholars learned from and extended the teachings and insights of Greek philosophy. And as Europe emerged from the Dark Ages, it had to learn from the teachings and other advances of Islam. The splintering of Islamic culture was affected by the Crusades, a series of conflicts beginning in 1095, ending in 1453. The Muslim-Christian confrontation still colors that relationship today. The Christian West saw Islamic expansion as a religious and a political threat. The Crusades ended in 1453 with the fall of Constantinople to the Turks, and it was renamed Istanbul and became the seat of the Ottoman Empire, 1281 all the way to 1924. Other Islamic empires were the Persian Safavid, 1501 to 1722, the Indian Mughal, 1520 to 1857. These were other Islamic empires. And during the 18th century, there was a marked decline in Islamic empires and the rise of European colonialism. Now, there were also many Islamic revivalist movements in the 17th, 18th century in Asia, in Africa, and in India. New Islamic states emerged in Arabia, North Africa, in Nigeria, in Libya, in Sudan. Many of these efforts involved a desire to return to pure prayer and praise practices of Islam. The revivalist movements of the 19th and 20th centuries were prompted by an internal weakness of these countries and the external threat of European colonialism. And by the late 20th century, Islamic revivalism was out and out a reaction to Western exploitation. So you see the differences in the 17th, 18th century, a desire to return to kind of a purity of practice, prayer and praise. 19th and 20th, their own weakness of Islamic countries in combination with perceived threat. And by the 20th century, it was out and out a reaction to what was perceived as the invasive threat of Western countries. There were several newly created states with artificial boundaries drawn after World War I without consultation with the Arab people. In Jordan, Syria, and Iraq, hopes were that Western modernism would work, and they were shattered in the 1950s and 60s. A series of things, including overthrows of duly elected governments by Western, including American police, secret police. The traumatic 1967 Arab-Israeli war involved the loss of Jerusalem to the Arab people, and that sparked change, including and leading up to the 1979 Iranian Revolution and the rise of Islamic fundamentalism in an effort to throw off Western oppression. Late 20th century revivalism in Islam. During this time, this revival, more Muslims have become personally more observant, and the religion has spread, including in America. New Islamic governments were established in Iran, Sudan, and Afghanistan. There's also been a rise in radical Islamic organizations practicing terrorism, that lesser jihad. The modern nation states created by the West in the Middle East after World War I did not respect the traditional borders. Colonial states won independence with a strong Muslim influence. Modern Western-like states prospered, while traditional Muslim states did not. In the 1960s and 70s, there was a series of wars and riots that ended this. Modern states lost their credibility. There was a great questioning within Islam, leading to the Iranian Revolution in 1979. Disillusion with Western modernism led to a return of Islamic states. There was a quest for greater authenticity in Islam, in politics, and in religion. Failures were seen as resulting from the departing from the true faith. Strongmen, rulers that used Islamic symbols to strengthen their regimes included Gaddafi in Libya, Zul-ul-Haq in Pakistan, Sadat in Egypt, and Jafar Numeri in Sudan. Gradually, Islamic candidates began to win in elections. Most Muslim governments were authoritarian in their traditional form. Some radical Islamic groups began to attack the West. There was conflict within Islam over interpretations of the Quran. Traditional interpretations had been made in patriarchal cultures and also in response to 7th century Arabian society, which had defined the role and meaning and relevance of Islam. This struggle for the soul of Islam between conservatives and reformers, mainstream Muslims and extremists, evoked questions such as who should interpret Islam, how reform should be achieved. Major issues included the proper relationship of religion to state and society, the role of Islamic law, the status of women and non-Muslims, the relation of Islam to the West, the compatibility of Islam and democracy, new opportunities for peace, democracy, expanded human rights, political, social, and economic empowerment, and an increasing acceptance in Western societies of the Judeo-Christian Islamic tradition became a possibility. Islam today has 4 general orientations. There are the secularists, in which religion is personal, excluded from politics and public life. Again, these are not unlike what we find in Christianity and Judaism. Conservatives who follow the past tradition are wary of change. consider it heresy. Mainstream lay activists who practice social and political activism are based on a return to the fundamentals. And the Muslim Brotherhood's holistic understanding, spiritual and temporal. It's been a slow process to change traditional interpretations of Islamic law, for example, women, and modern reformers who distinguish between the divine law and the very human interpretation of it. And they are more open to reinterpretation. So you have those different orientations: secularists, mainstream lay activists, the Muslim Brotherhood, and modern reformers. Who gets to interpret Islam today? Well, the ulama, the scholars, and religious leaders, or laity and governments. What are the acceptable interpretations of Islam for the modern world? Could democracy be a fit with an Islamic state? What about the role of women? Sometimes new Islamic states use women to show their Islamic credentials by taking away their rights. Many women are fighting back by wearing the traditional headscarf and returning to the mosque for women's study and prayer groups. Women have begun writing and speaking out for themselves. In reality, the status of women in Muslim societies varies greatly. Quranic verses that seem to oppress women do come out of 7th century Arabian context. Islam is trying to accomplish a transition to modernism, doing in a few decades what it took Christianity and Judaism centuries to accomplish. The primary issue, tradition versus reform, conservative versus progressive. That's important for us to remember that, Islam is by far the youngest of these three faiths, and Judaism and Christianity worked out over many centuries this movement into modernism, whereas for Islam, they're not only trying to do it in a fairly short time, but doing it in front of the whole world on television. Muslims have been present in America since before the 19th century. African-American Islam emerged early in the 20th century. The Nation of Islam leader Wallace D. Fard Muhammad taught liberation from the Quran and the Bible. With his mysterious disappearance in 1934, Elijah Muhammad built a national organization. It was not mainstream Islam at first, but then became more observant. The 9/11 hijacking shattered the hopes and dreams of many Muslims for peace with the West. For Muslims, the 21st century requires educating, engaging in dialogue with, and finding new ways with which to work with and within the West and the global civilization. And so my hope is that this introduction to Islam is helpful to you as we work together for greater understanding and respect. God bless you.